Somebody joined us remotely on the phone?
Yes, this is Greg Bolt from DRI.
Okay, thank you. Heather, are you on the phone?
I'm sorry, I had my mic off. Yes, I am on the line. This is Heather with Stetson.
Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and get started then. A little bit late, sorry. Thank you to all of you that are here. Appreciate you being here. Also, welcome to those of you that are on the phone. We have Heather Steele with Stetson Engineering and also Greg Pohl with Desert Research Institute. So welcome to you as well. And they're excuse me. They're following. They have the presentation, but they're going to have to go through. We're going to have to tell them when to change the slides. So bear with us when we do that. Again, so welcome. I'm Don Zadiba, General Manager of Indian Wells Valley Water District. And I'll introduce the members of the presentation team here. First, we have Wade Major with Aqualogic. To your left, Tim Parker with Parker Groundwater. And Paul Thorne with Rambo. And I also want to acknowledge Ryan Elvard, sitting in the audience. Ryan is kind of behind the scenes, but he was instrumental in putting the presentation together, so I want to acknowledge him as well. So I guess I'm in control. We'll go to the second slide. What you're going to see is a hydrological conceptual model, and the more I say that, I kind of stumble over it, so I'm going to call the HCM, so that's what I'm referring to. It's part of a brackish groundwater feasibility study that is being conducted through a cooperative effort of Searles Valley Minerals, Mojave Pistachio, Coastal Geothermal, and Indian Wells Valley Water District. Excuse me. I haven't got my morning voice yet. The purpose is to evaluate the brackish groundwater supply within the basin, looking at that as a possible source to treat that water and maybe use it as a potable water source to help be a supplemental source for the basin. There's several tasks involved in this study, and this hydrological, the HCM is one of them. The study is actually being funded through a grant received by the Department of Water Resources in the amount of $1,084,000. So we were very fortunate to get that. We actually received more than we requested, which is very unusual. Going to slide 3. So why do a 3D digital HCM? Basically, it allows us to see what's below our feet, what's in the ground in terms of soil, and also in terms of geological features, such as faults, things like that. This valley has several faults in it, and this will help to verify those that we know and also perhaps map some new ones, which we'll see here shortly. The HCM is critical to understanding the relationship between all these variables, the structures, the soil. And also, it is the framework for excuse me, quantitative analysis of changes, allows us to look at different, how the basin reacts to different pumping scenarios, climate change and such. So what you're going to see is actually a compilation of all the available data that's been obtained throughout the basin, new data as well as some data that was collected previously in terms of well logs, drillers' logs, seismic studies, those sorts of things. So we'll go to the next slide. This HCM is going to be the largest collection of digital geological and water quality data that's been assembled to date. Obviously, there'll be more collected in the future, which can be added to this model. It's to be freely shared with the Groundwater Authority, with the Water Resource Manager, Stetson, with the U.S. Navy, and with Desert Research Institute. It'll also be provided to state as part of this project that's being funded by the Department of Water Resources. And it's meant to complement the existing body of work that's been compiled so far in the basin. Not meant to compete with any models that have been done. The Desert Research Institute model, which is an upgrade of the Brown and Caldwell model, the intent is not to have competing models, but to provide additional information that could be considered for improving or adding to the existing DRI model. We'll go to the next slide. The topics we're going to cover today, you can see the history of the studies in the basin, the history and the scope of the brackish groundwater study, the scope of the Stanford State Local Agency Denmark Groundwater Architecture Project, which is called the GAP project, how that meshes with the brackish groundwater feasibility study. We'll go over the project funding, how it's being paid for, the HCM themes, HCM main topics, the workshop schedule, workshop activities, and the next steps. We're going to the next slide. Just briefly, a history of the studies in the basin. The first study that we're aware of is from 1913, called The Groundwater Resources of Indian Wells Valley, California, by C.H. Lee. Most of you have been following groundwater for a while now, since Sigma, so you know there's lots of studies available. The cooperative group, for a long time on their website, has maintained links to a lot of these studies. The East Current Resource Conservation District has a lot of them in their library. Some of them are mentioned here: Brown and Caldwell, Todd, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, USGS. You can see the names there. But it's important to note that we're collecting more data as time goes on. We're always learning more. You've heard people say this is one of the most studied basins in California, and that's true. But we're always adding to that knowledge. The original groundwater model from 1971 has continued to be updated. Brown and Caldwell did a model, and it was updated by Desert Research Institute recently. We've got additional data on lithology, faults, water quality, and that's added to our overall knowledge of the basin. This brackish groundwater study is going to add to what we know, and it's continuing to evolve. So, next slide. Just a brief history. The Water District has been looking at brackish water as a possible source to augment supply for quite a while. Going back to 2006, there was a brackish water pilot study done. It was actually design work for a pilot plant to be done out at the old Neal Ranch property to the northwest part of the valley. The district did the study, treated the water, determined a cost of about, I think it was around $2,500 an acre foot, which was pretty expensive. But it did determine that it could be done. So what you're seeing now is kind of a follow-through on that effort. The district, after the study was done, had wanted to look at determining what the brackish water resource is, how much is there in the basin. We started to think about going about that alone, but with the funding at about $400,000, we started seeing if there's interest in getting partners. So we ended up with what we have today, which is, again, Searles Valley Minerals was interested, Coastal Geothermal, and Mojave Pistachio. So with that partnership, this groundwater feasibility study was conceived. We applied for a grant, which, again, we received that grant, and As you can see, the conceptual model that you're going to see is still relatively preliminary, still in development, but by the end of the summer we hope to finalize it. So it's still a work in progress, and that's why we're here, to show you what the model looks like. Again, it uses the SkyTem data that was collected in October of 2016, plus all historical data that's available in the basin through well logs, drillers logs, TDS measurements, and we'll get into that into detail. So next slide, I think this is where I turn it over to Wade.
Thank you, Don. So before I get into describing some of the tasks as part of the brackish study, I wanted to talk about how you actually treat brackish groundwater. And so the approach we're looking at in this valley is reverse osmosis. In the simplest of terms, salty brackish water goes in one end of the treatment system, and fresh water comes out the other end. Now you also have a super concentrated, very salty waste stream that comes out of the process. Any salt you remove is going to get concentrated, leaving you with two components, the freshwater component and the brine component, or the reject component. Inland desalination projects struggle with what to do with the brine. If you're in a coastal area and you desalinate seawater, it's pretty easy to take that brine and pump it back into the ocean. But what do you do if you're 100 or 200 miles from the ocean? So traditionally, inland communities have looked at things like enhanced evaporation or evaporation ponds. They add to the cost and complexity of the project. Indian Wells Valley is fortunate in that there are two entities that are willing to take the brine as a resource, and that's Coastal Geothermal and Sears Valley Minerals. So instead of having to concentrate that brine down into basically salt residuals that have to be either hauled off-site and disposed of in a landfill, we have two funding partners that are willing to take that product as a resource for use in their processes. Now that's unique, and that's why this project is particularly attractive. In terms of where we are today, this is we're approaching the sum total knowledge of evaluating the basin resources, identifying some of the data gaps, and filling in some of those with some supplemental data that we've collected, additional geophysical logs, additional TDS samples, mapping, and profiling. Once the HCM is complete by the end of the summer, we're going to roll into actually starting to look at the feasibility evaluations. We're going to focus on a hydraulic feasibility evaluation, which relates to where can we pump from, how much can we pump, and what are the effects of pumping that brackish groundwater? Do we see changes in the water quality in the basin? Do we see effects such as land subsidence, the settling of the land? We're going to look at the treatment feasibility. By taking actual samples of the brackish groundwater, what is the optimum treatment train to remove the salt and the other materials to produce the fresh water? Obviously, we have to look at the pipeline routing feasibility. How do you connect all of this together? Where is the optimum location for the plant or plants to be located? And then how do you run the pipelines, either from the brackish extraction wells, the brine out to Coastal Geothermal or Sears Valley Minerals, and then connecting to the water district's water system with the fresh water that you produce. The sum total of all of that will be combined into a feasibility report, which will prepare us to lead into the next steps, which are demonstrating the proof of concept, developing a conceptual plant design, and actually going out and doing some pilot testing on the true source of brackish groundwater that we would like to consider for development. In terms of this project, what we're doing right now is a subset of a larger project. The Stanford Gap project shown on the screen, on the bottom of the screen, is looking at using the SkyTem geophysical techniques to enhance knowledge of 3 aquifers in California. The Indian Wells Valley Basin is one of those 3 aquifers that has been chosen as part of the larger Stanford Gap project. The other 2 are in Butte County, and then the Paso Robles Basin in San Luis Obispo County. So we're fortunate that we're part of a larger program that is looking to evaluate these resources within California. All of the work within the Stanford Gap project that we're currently trying to complete by the end of the summer is going to roll up into our particular task, and out of that will fall our additional feasibility work in evaluating the hydraulics, the treatment, the pipeline routing, and summarizing all of that into a feasibility report. As Don mentioned, there's two sources of funding. The Brackish Groundwater Feasibility Study has a total budget of approximately $1.5 million. As Don mentioned, a Prop 1 grant has been awarded in the total of $1.1 million. Local funding has been provided up front by 4 funding partners to the tune of $370,000. The Water District, Mojave Pistachios, Coastal Geothermal, and Sears Valley Mineral have all contributed funding to this project. The Stanford Gap project, a little bit larger to evaluate those 3 basins, $2.1 million of total funding, with $600,000 coming from the state of California, an additional $700,000 coming from the Kingdom of Denmark, as they are the developers of the SkyTem AEM technology, and local funding to the tune of $300,000, again, the bulk of which provided by the Water District, but also contributions from Coastal Geothermal, Meadowbrook Dairy, and Mojave Pistachios. This HCM workshop, we're really going to focus on 3 particular themes. Historical correlation. How well does the data synthesis, everything that we've gathered up through all the historical reports, how do they compare and contrast? How does that tie into the existing knowledge base that we have within the basin? Second main theme is going to be new knowledge and products. What new things, what new insights have been garnered by this process that we've gone through, and what new products are going to fall out of this? And this is going to include the development of a comprehensive data management system, and secondly, a 3-dimensional digital HCM that's going to compile everything that we've come across, and it's going to be shared and accessible with the stakeholders in the valley. Now, this is important. This is basically like a large filing cabinet. There are lots of documents out there and available. I know that colleagues on the TAC have got filing cabinets at home with hard copy reports. All of this information is being gathered, being digitized, and being incorporated into this 3-dimensional model as a current state canonical source of data that can be added to in the future as more information, new knowledge, and new data comes to light. And finally, the third theme relates to the Brackish Water Project in particular. How does this feed into this potential source of water being developed as an alternate supply? The main topics that we're going to cover focus on the geometry and structure of the basin, the hydrogeologic units that we've seen, and how the brackish water is distributed within the basin. Our schedule for today: Paul and Tim are going to go through an overview of a number of main topics. At the end of a particular topic, we're going to allocate a 15-minute block of time for a discussion. Now, this is a notional amount. If we're having a robust discussion, we will carry on with that discussion. But we've identified certain breaks in the presentation where we can have Q&A and discuss stuff and roll up our sleeves. The most important reason why we want to do this is because we want your feedback. There's a lot of knowledge in this room about this basin. Cumulatively, centuries, if not millennia of knowledge that we would like to be able to incorporate into the HCM. We want to make it as current and as up-to-date as we possibly can. The results from those discussions are going to help us evolve the HCM, and critical key comments that come out of today will hopefully be incorporated into that HCM to make it better. A word about scale and cross-sections. You're going to see a lot of figures today. They all come from different sources, and they all have different scales, both vertically and horizontally. The vertical range of one cross-section might be greater than another. You may, for example, see a cross-section that shows a mile going across the page. The next one you might see may be 20 or 30 miles. In terms of Oh, sorry, that's the horizontal scale. The vertical scale, you may see cross-sections going down to 22,000 feet in the basin. Some of the seismic data that we have extends down to 22,000 feet below the ground surface. In other cases, you may only see a figure or a section that's showing the top 1,000 feet. So it's important to keep in mind the scale of these figures. They're not all to the same scale. They don't all necessarily show the same thing. Now I'm going to use Albert here in a little example of this. Poor Albert doesn't know that he's about to get sucked into a black hole, and there's some scale effects that are going to happen to him. So if we adjust the scale of Albert because we want to take a look at something in the vertical scale, this happens to Albert. If we adjust the scale because we want to look at something horizontally, this happens to poor Albert. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these figures, that the horizontal scale is going to be much greater than the vertical scale in terms of miles versus hundreds, if not thousands of feet. And with that, I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague Paul, who's going to start taking you through the technical elements of the HCM.
Thank you, Wade. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be here and get to present a lot of the data that I've been looking over the last couple of months. I've been primarily responsible for taking in all the data, putting it into the Geoscene 3D computer program, where I can take all the different data, combine it into one pile, and then begin to look and see what's going on. And that's what I'm going to present to you today. And the green laser works, so I don't have to go old school. Anyway, I just want to quickly outline the basin that you're probably very familiar with. But when we go through this, often we'll talk about a particular portion of the basin. We have the main part of the basin here, and then we've divided it up into the northwest, the northern, the Playa Lake area, the southwest, and then we have another region, the El Paso area. So these are different areas that I'll be referring to along the way, just to keep in mind. For those following at home, can we see the number of the slide? We're on slide number, oh, there it is. Slide number 19. What I'm going to start off with right now is the data. I want to present to you the data that we've been using in the modeling. Now, this is data that we've spent the winter and spring digitizing, trying to get the coordinates located on the wells and everything put together. It hasn't been easy. And in fact, we're still doing the last parts. And that's why we want to keep in mind that this is still a work in progress. We're getting new information as to the location of the wells, which is very important when we go and make the interpretation of what's going on. So, again, these are the preliminary studies that we're continually improving until we come up with the final version. So, I have a map here that basically shows some of the data that we're working with. The light blue dots indicate all of the wells in which we have coordinates on. So this is all the well locations that we have lithological data from the driller's logs. The pink boxes right here are all the wells that we have geophysical logs from. And then the lines here are the seismic lines that have been run that we have access to the data. So this is just a video you may have seen previously, but I wanted to show it just to kind of see what we can see when we go through in Geoscene. And you can see the number of wells that are spread out that we're using. There we go. So, to give you an example of what I see in the software, you can go in and zoom in on the particular well. Now, this is one of the digitized wells. These are two of our deepest wells. You're probably also familiar with it, the Snort 1 and Snort 2 well. And we've simplified the lithology into generally sand, which will be predominantly sand, and maybe sandy or gravelly sand, and so forth. And that's the yellow colors. And we have lithology that's predominantly clay. And that's your clay deposits that will have the lower hydraulic conductivity. And then we can also see the gravel. And then we've also denominated sandstone, which is the red color here, limestone, which is the green color, and then basalt and granites here. But this is what we look at when we look at the different wells. So when I go into Geoscene and begin to mark where do we have our different layers, it's this sort of data that I'm looking at. And then I can put, if there's different layers that I want to interpret, I can put interpretive points on there in order to make the model. I have to lift it up. Okay. Yeah, I might do that. Just say next slide. So you don't really look at the wells alone. You want to use them in cross sections. So what we do is we have a number of profiles across the basin, and then you can get in and see how everything looks together. And it's kind of a mix and match, but you can go in and look at the details. So go ahead and click. Yeah, we're still on 22. One of the things that we've also included is these little black lines here, so we can see exactly where the well screens are, which is also useful information if we're looking at water levels and other things like that. And again, in the slide here we have the sand, and we have gravel from the driller's logs. And then you can see it's varying composition, but this area here, even though there's a lot of different layers, is predominantly clay. So we can kind of begin to group that into different layers. And again, you can start to put in interpretation points that we can start to make our different layers. And now we're on slide 23. Actually, I think it's 20. I think it's 24 because we added the animation, which the people at home didn't get to see. So I'll keep that in mind. We're one slide ahead. So at home, this should be slide 24 or 22. Slide 22. And here we have the interpolation, the interpretive points. When we make all of the points in, what we do then is we go through an interpolation process, and then the points that we think are related to each other, we can make a surface. And that will be our surface into the different hydrogeological zones. And so that's what we do here, where we have our surface. When we have no data, of course, that's where we begin to be a little uncertain with regard to our surfaces. And you can see that there's some points here that aren't related to wells. Well, that comes from our other data that we have. And I'll go through that now. So we have the lithology from the wells. We also have geophysical data. And a lot of the geophysics, of course, you heard of. We have the aerial electromagnetics, AEM, which is our SkyTem. We have our well logs, which include electrical resistivity, gamma ray, deep induction, spontaneous potential, amongst others. And so we can use these well logs in our interpretation. We have the seismic data. We have also TEM, the ground-based TEM. What we need to keep in mind with regard to the geophysical methods is we cannot use them alone. We need to combine them with, for example, our lithology data. We need to have it also with our water quality data. So we need to take all of this into one and keep in mind what each little piece is telling us. So when we get all of this data in, the lithology, we can begin to look at the structure, combine the lithology, and begin to make the proper interpretations. Yeah. So, just as an example, again, what we see in Geocene, we can display our well logs within Geocene and begin to make the interpretations. So this well, for example, they've conducted gamma ray, deep resistivity, and deep induction. And so we can look at this well log data and see, all right, where are our boundaries? What do we see? How well does that correlate with our nearby wells? And so we can begin to put in some interpretation points. And now we're on slide 25 for those at home, and we're looking at seismic data. This is the seismic section that we're able to load into Geocene. Keep in mind that this section is now 22,000 feet deep, and what we're interested in groundwater is this area up here. So there is a resolution that we need to keep in mind. This section is in the northern parts of the basin from the northwest to the northeast. Go ahead. So next slide. So this is what it looks like when we zoom in. It may seem a little not very good, but actually we can get a lot of data from these seismic sections. Even though it's a line, we can see the definite reflection layers on that. And so we can pull this data off and combine it with the well data that we have. So the seismics are proven to be actually a very important part of our interpretation as well. Next slide. And then, of course, we have the aerial AEM, the SkyTEM data. And you can see the flight lines in the orange dots here that we've conducted. And you can see the areas where the Stanford has conducted the ground-based TEM or the WACTEM data. So we have the electromagnetic data that we can use in our interpretation, and it has been one of the biggest bases of our interpretation. One of the great things about the SkyTEM project is look at the coverage we have on the basin. Never before have we had more information than what we do now. So when we combine this, we can use this to get into the details of the basin. Now, in order to do this, of course, we have to also interpret it with the lithological logs, and then we can start to make our geological interpretation, or the interpretation of the depositional environment, and also of the salinity within the groundwater. In the second phase, the resistivity will be converted to hydraulic conductivity. That will be in phase 2. Next slide. So this is just a little video of the collection of SkyTEM. You may have seen it in the previous meeting, but it shows very nicely exactly how this data is collected. It's quite quick. And I would say easy, but I don't know how easy it is. I just interpret the data. And I might point out, this is just an aside story, but I was in Denmark when they first started this in 2004. And the farmers were extremely upset because they thought it was scaring their cows. And they were very worried. And so at some point, some of the municipalities stopped giving permission for the helicopter to fly over with this out of concern for the livestock. And the farmers would complain. But after they did it enough times, they realized that, that wasn't a problem. Yeah, I don't know if we can go on. There you go. And this is, after it's all collected, you can see the flight lines, but unfortunately you can't see this at home because this is another video. But this is a video of what we can see in Geocene when you fly around in the 3 dimensions. And so you can see the actual resistivity at depth and how it changes. And so you can go around and move your screen in and out and exactly see what's going on. But this is how it looks, where you can see the high resistivity and the low resistivities and begin to make the interpolations or interpretations from that. Okay, and now I got to keep in mind, I think we're 3 slides ahead at home, so I think we're on slide 28. And what I just want to mention now is exactly how we use the SkyTem data, because it's very important with regard to this model. Electrical resistivity is correlated to a combination of the lithology and with the water quality. And the whole point is, when you look at water quality, total dissolved solids, the higher the total dissolved solids, or the TDS, in your water, the lower the electrical conductivity is. The fresher your water is, the more resistance there is. So the higher the resistivity. So high TDS, low resistivity, low TDS, high resistivity. However, we also have lithology. So there's 2 different factors that we have to take into consideration. Fine grain, especially clay, the clay material, you have low resistivity. The cleaner the sands and gravels, the higher the resistivity. So we can begin to combine these 2 to make our interpolation. The scales that we have, I just want to point out, are logarithmic, but we can take this color scale and use it directly to do our interpretation. Next slide. So, when we look at low resistivity, below 20 ohm meters, these are the green and blue colors on the scale. That's where we get especially unconsolidated or consolidated sediments with higher clay content, or it could be brackish water. The lower the resistivity, the higher the salinity. When we start looking at the medium resistivities, the greenish yellow, orange, yellow and orange colors, right in this range here, that's where we start to get the sands and gravels under the water table. So this is the saturated zone, sands and gravels, as long as the water is relatively fresh. So that's what we see, sands and gravels with fresh water in the yellow-green colors, yellow and orange. So we go to the next slide. So the high resistivity, if we're looking at between 80 to 150 ohm meters, that's where we see especially sands and gravels above the water table. If we're in the unsaturated zone above the water table, the resistivity is relatively high. And we can see that in the SkyTem data. I should also point out that our quaternary volcanic deposits that we see within the basin are also fairly high in the resistivity. And that indicates especially the orangish red and the red colors with the higher resistivity. And so then we can see also the very high resistivity, over 150 ohm meters generally. That's where we get to the dark red and into the purple colors. That's where we see the high resistivity basement rock, especially the granite. Next slide. So this is an example of the SkyTem profile. I took it up in the northwestern part of the basin. And you can see exactly the resistivities and how to interpret them. Here you have kind of the red and even into the purple, but this is our unsaturated zone. So we can use the SkyTem to actually see where the water table is, combined with, of course, our water level measurements. Here we have the finer or the coarser materials with the yellow and orange colors. Here we have more finer materials, a little bit coarser under the water table with the yellow colors. And then here we have especially clay materials and likely some saline, higher salinity or higher TDS. Now we have something called depth of investigation. And this is important. With all of the information that I just gave you, that information is good until this level. This is what the geophysicists basically calculate. How deep are we certain about the resistivities? Below this level, the resistivities become uncertain. And so when we look at these slides, you just need to keep in mind that's the level of certainty here, uncertain underneath. Personally, I do not want to just cut off and mask the data underneath because it still can give us trends. We can see in this slide here, even though it's under the depth of investigation or DOI, that it increases. And that increase could actually be that, even though it's still green colors, that we actually have coarse materials with fairly fresh or slightly brackish water. So even though it's under the depth of investigation, we can still see signals out of that. So we don't want to just throw away that data. Okay, next slide. And again, we have an interpolated line here, and I just wanted to point out our SkyTem doesn't go deep enough so we can't see the basement, and that this was determined looking at the seismic data, which I showed before. So next slide. We also have, of course, this is a brackish water study, we have TDS. So this is the TDS measurements that we have within the basin. I just want to show it now, but I'll go through this in much more detail at the end of today. Next slide. And this is what the TDS data looks like in a profile from the center of the basin, trending a little bit towards the northeast. But the nice thing is you can look at the TDS data and see how it changes with depth and across the profile. Next slide. So I just want to go through quickly what it looks like when we combine all the data. And this is, of course, our well data. And then we have the TDS data combined with it. And then we can put the SkyTem data and then seismic on top of it. And this is how we can begin to make the interpretation of the HCM. Next slide. With that, I think I'll welcome any questions or comments that you have with regard to the data.
So for questions, this is being recorded, so if you have a question or a comment, if you'd come to the podium and use the microphone, please, and we'll be glad to address your comment.
I'm Don Decker. My question for you is the synthesis that you're describing is coming from obviously many sources, and the uncertainties in those various contributions vary a lot. And in order to actually accommodate all of those data sources, you've got to obviously accommodate, you've got to analyze, you've got to figure out how the various contributions and what their relative weights are. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. And of course, that's a very important point, in that you also have to quality control the data that's coming in to the model. And yeah, there's different ways. The way that I've done it is I've looked at the data set as a whole. Now, when we look at, for example, just the lithology data, there's a wide range in quality from the driller's logs that come in. And so when you look at the whole, a lot of times you're going back to the original driller's log and say, okay, is there something that doesn't quite match here, or what's going on? And then those pieces of data that you become unsure about, you note down, and then you look at and see how it corresponds with the other pieces of data. Like, for example, the SkyTem. And you can go back and forth and start to get a better idea of which data can we trust and which data is a lot more uncertain about that. But a lot of times it means going back to the original source of the description of the data and going back to the original reports.
My question really was after a more quantitative explanation of how you fold these together. The depth sensitivity, the depth uncertainty in SkyTem is relatively large, and you've got to obviously tie it to your, as Max would say, your calibration points. Yeah. So I understand that perfectly, but it's not just a question of reliability, it's also a question of literally uncertainties in the measurements themselves, and how that gets folded in ultimately to the profiles that you're showing. And we're obviously not at this point talking about even 1 foot resolutions, but nevertheless, those uncertainties, whatever they may be, need to be literally quantitatively folded in. Otherwise, there isn't really a quantitative model.
Yeah, I agree, Don. And one of the things we haven't talked about is the second phase of the project. But the initial phase, this is the initial phase, kind of the classical hydrogeologic conceptualization. And so one of the processes we're going through is screening the driller's logs and screening out the ones that are of questionable quality. And that's a work in process. The other thing is, and we haven't touched on this yet, but the base-wide hydrogeologic conceptual effort where they drilled 26 soil borings and cored a lot of those. We're in the process of digitizing those, so that's kind of to give you an idea of the state that we're in. Those are going to be digitized in the next couple of weeks. Those are higher quality, obviously. The Bureau of Rec wells that were drilled are higher quality. So, and I'm going to touch on some of that when I go through the references. But yeah, it's a subjective process in that sense, as you know. And the second phase of the project, however, we're going to use a little more sophisticated process to actually quantify some of that uncertainty by doing a modeling, stochastic probabilistic modeling of the lithology. And that will actually give us, build in some quantitative uncertainty into the process. So, but it's going to be based on the initial classical as well. So that's one of the reasons we're having these workshops, because we want to hear input from those of you that have been working in this basin for decades. And how many scientists in the room? Come on, raise your hands. There's a lot of scientists in this basin that have been working for years, and so we want to tap into the intellectual knowledge that's out there and get input. And we'll be bringing this to the TAC at some point when we are in a final draft form to get more input. So I hope that will help address your concerns, Don.
I would say my comments weren't based on so much concern. I'm just interested in how you can handle the complexity of that very issue that I brought up. And of course, every investigation has that aspect, that area as a major concern. But when you've got such a disparate collection as exists here, it becomes paramount that there be an attempt anyway at a quantitative resolution of how the pieces actually fit together, or if they even do. Mm-hmm. But your comment, Tim, about a stochastic statistical approach is a partial answer as to where where you're headed, and I would agree that's absolutely a proper model territory to step into, although it's a gigantic undertaking. I'm being a little gentle there since it's so complex. And when you blend together, generalize the lithography that's discovered in wells, you have to be really careful about your choices, because you may not discover any similarity between one well and another that aren't that far apart when you make those assumptions.
Yeah, and because this basin's so faulted, there are wells that are very different when they're not very far apart. So it's another complexity.
But I think, again, that's one of the problems that we've had when you have also a difference in just the lithological logs from the drillers and the drillers' descriptions. And in the end, you end up making some assumptions that you need to be careful about.
Are you done answering Don's question? So, Tim, it's your fault that there are faults in there, right? A couple things. So, just listen to Don's question. I'm not a scientist, so I'd look at things in general terms and trends. That's how we look at money. So I don't really care about the little deviations in there. I care about, am I heading to a profit or a loss? And sadly, sometimes more of a loss in my world. But wouldn't it make sense that all your variations on a theme and all your deviations, or what do you want to call them, anomalies, when you put it all together, doesn't it kind of tell you the truth anyways? Isn't that how that kind of works? I mean, unless everything itself was faulted in the same way, wouldn't the basic knowledge base kind of tell you a true trend or a true zone? Maybe not plus or minus a foot, but give us, and we're looking at an overview, not exacting, centimeters or millimeters, but it's just an overview. And that overview would have to make some kind of logical sense. Is that oversimplifying something?
No.
Okay.
In fact, so as Don mentioned, and I would say that we can almost weight some of the data in terms of its quality. And I mentioned a couple of the studies, the base-wide characterization, the Bureau of Rec.
Right.
A lot of the CB wells have pretty good lithology. And then you have the driller's logs.
Which you would give it a different weight because of the unknown way of collecting.
Yeah, that's highly variable depending on the driller and whether or not there was somebody else present. And so... or
whether we did it 2 weeks later.
Yeah, so that's some of our true setting. But as hydrogeologists, we want to have multiple data sources to build a picture. So that means water level, water quality, lithology, mineralogy, structure, and then we have geophysics. Geophysics is a relative measurement. It's not a precise measurement. It's like a remote sensing. But what it does is it helps you connect the lines and dots from one borehole to another. And it's very repeatable. So you can start to connect those things that may be not as certain with some of the logs you have with this, where you can see a very distinct signal from several different geophysical logs at one point to another point. I hope that helps, because when you then connect, instead of having these points and lines, a very small part of the aquifer system going downward that a borehole represents, minuscule when you look at the basin, you then have these whole lines that connect those dots. That's the true value of this SkyTEM in terms of really building a more comprehensive picture of the subsurface.
So when you're interpreting it between those lines, because of the SkyTEM data, it gives you a better way to interpret that space that you don't have boreholes or actual real-life data for.
That's exactly right, and the same is true for the seismic data.
Did you say that again? You said I was right?
Yes.
I like that. No. Okay, so actually the question I came up here with is, what surprises have you found? In other words, we've interpreted data forever, and we have these huge data gaps. Like we go out to the southwest, we go much further out, and you have like 3 wells, and very little thises and that's. And so that's all been interpreted through the years. So is there any new or anything that's like surprised you when you compile this information?
We're not going to answer that right now, Peter.
Oh,
sorry.
You.
You have to wait and see the next parts of the presentation.
All right.
We'll go into the interpretation and we'll get it to you.
Yeah, my name's Larry Mead, and I just want to say, keep this up. You guys are on the right track. Keep going this way. Don't give up on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Larry.
Anybody else?
Anybody on the phone have a question?
Are you still on the phone?
Yeah, we're still on. No questions at this time.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Heather, anything on your end?
I'd like to know, because I can't see it from where I'm sitting, exactly how deep can the SkyTEM process accurately predict?
That depends. That actually depends on a number of things, because it varies throughout the basin. And that's why it's important to look at the depth of investigation. What we see, for example, is if there's generally high resistivity in the profiles, we have a really, really deep depth of investigation, at times as far deep as about 800 meters. Whereas if there's a lot of high or really low, low resistive units, then the depth of investigation can be as little as about 600 feet or 200 meters is what we generally see. So it basically runs in between those levels. But as I mentioned before as well, as the SkyTEM we have goes to about the data we get back, we've interpolated or processed down to about 800, 900 meters. And so that's the deepest depth that we can see any signal from. So that's the general depths that we can get down to.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so the clays and the when you have brackish water, you can't see as deep. Correct. When you have gravels, mostly gravels and sands, like along the Sierra Nevada, we can see much deeper.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I have another area that I'd like to briefly touch on. Your analysis is a time domain analysis, and so your deeper signal has a delay, and that's how you discriminate with depth. How do you sort out the multipath reflections and refractions from the complexities that we've got, the interbedded, very different materials, clays, and then relatively coarse materials, and so on? How do you handle multipath?
Is this with respect to the SkyTem data or the seismic?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, I'm talking about SkyTem in particular.
Yeah, the SkyTem. Yeah. I believe that a lot of this is filtered out through the processing of the data. So when the data goes through the inversion, a lot of the multipath, as I understand, gets filtered out. And so you can have a true, when you develop a multi-layer model, that you can produce the model there. Unfortunately, I'm not a geophysicist, so I'm not exactly certain how they do that along those lines.
Stan Rotora. One of the problems that the GSA has had is getting data on all the wells. Do you feel that you have got data on all of the wells that you really need? Have you had any problems getting that? Because there are other pieces of data floating around that might be useful to you. And I'm just curious, are you still looking for well data?
Yes.
Always.
You're always looking. May I ask, do you feel that you have a majority of the large farm wells?
Yes, I believe we do.
Okay.
And, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're in the process of digitizing the well logs from the base-wide hydrogeologic conceptual report, characterization report, and that just got kind of overlooked. It's so easy to overlook things because the logs were actually in the report, and going through the reports we realized, we don't have those, so we have CSUs digitizing those. I think that's actually the last big one, but we don't know for sure. That's why we're going to come back and do another workshop sometime after we get the draft final hydrogeologic conceptual model report put together, and we'll do this again, and we'll have some more details, I think, to provide and share. But great question.
How important, there's hundreds of small wells. Is it really important to have all of those wells, or is it just the larger, deeper ones that you're interested in?
It has to do with the spatial coverage that we have, and also the particular area in the basin, although not much of this basin isn't complex. I know that's a double negative, but because of the multitude of faults in it and the different sources coming off the mountains, and then the dump of sediments out of the Pleistocene coming in. So, but we'll be looking at that spatial coverage, and at some point coming back and saying identifying where we have data gaps from that perspective.
Okay, great.
We would certainly like to see some more TDS data, particularly in areas
in the southwest and in the northern and western portions of the base. So there's actually a field program that's going to happen in a couple of 3 weeks, working closely with Stefan and folks in the Navy to go out and collect some more water quality samples to fill in some of that missing salinity data that we don't yet have.
There's been recently some email traffic regarding the water dating or whatever. Was any of these new studies or new collections that you're going to do look at the dating of water? Just out of curiosity?
We're currently not planning any that kind of new data collection. We don't have a big budget for data collection. We have a very small budget, but we're really compiling everything out of the reports, all the age dating that was collected in the previous reports. And then we'll be using that. Also, there's some great information that was collected from the wells to show the difference in hydraulic head between different hydrogeologic zones. So that's the kind of stuff we're pulling in.
Could you give me a feel for what the cost is of doing age dating? Assuming you've got water samples, is that a significant cost, or is it a minor cost, or curiosity?
You know, I'm not sure right now. I think it's probably on the, I don't think it's a lot. I mean, you know, and it depends. So, yeah, I probably don't want to throw a number out.
We'll look that up
Yeah.
and get back to you, what an analytical sample costs for age dating.
Appreciate it.
If somebody in
Thank you
the
very
audience
much.
knows, please shout it out. But I don't
Yeah.
have that information on the... Eddie? $500 per sample for age dating?
Yeah, is that carbon, or is that tritium, or a combination of things? Okay.
It depends on what the age range is that you're trying to investigate. If you're into the, the 20,000 year BP, it requires a substantial concentration, a factor of 1,000, and it's time consuming. Not that there's labor necessarily connected with that time, but it's I don't know. Your $500 is for a routine age date. Yeah, I think the numbers for older water are a lot higher. That was what was being paid back in the Bureau Rec days, was considerably more than 500. That was 30 years ago.
Well, but the technology's really improved, and there's different options since then. So, thanks, Don. More questions?
Okay, I guess we'll move on to the next section.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good. Hey, Gary, can you move to advance to a slide that's going to be out of order? Let's see. So we had 2 extras. Where's the other end? 3 extras. So maybe slide 74. I'm looking for the references. It's going to say reference on the slide. So then this would be 43. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, did I kill everything? Okay. Yeah. So there we go. I just wanted to flip through some of the references we're using before I start talking about the showing some of the cross sections out of the report that I'm going to refer to. So, back in 1962, and this was actually one of my former professors that was part of this, mapped the geology in this area, and it's called the Trona sheet. And interestingly enough, I wanted to point out that there was a El Paso fault mapped in that map, but it was down along the Garlock fault, so it's at the south end of the basin is the El Paso fault. And then there was Baron Brock and Martin, 1991, and this is the title of the groundwater flow system, but I'm going to show some cross sections from it. There's the Bureau of Reclamation work, 1993. That was a very comprehensive work that the Indian Wells Valley Water District cooperated with, along with Searles Valley Minerals, if I recall right, to help do some deep borings. And then Monastero's paper, and we're going to show some sections out of that back in 2002. And then Tetra Tech did I mentioned this already, the base-wide hydrogeologic characterization report that had, I think it was 26 soil borings, and that were converted into 16 wells. That was a very comprehensive work, and like I said, they were cored in many areas, so that was something that's very high quality data. There was a lot of different hydraulic and chemical testing. We're bringing all that data into the conceptual model. And then there was quaternary fault and fold database that we tapped into, and I'll show a figure from that. Brown and Caldwell's 2009 report on that's when they developed the groundwater flow model. There's a fault activity map from the Department of Conservation and the geologic map of California from the Department of Conservation, and Tri-Echo TT, that joint venture of a couple of companies, the technical justification for beneficial use changes, and then finally the Desert Research Institute Groundwater Sources Sustainability, basically the modeling report. Now, Gary, I'm going to ask you to flip back to slide, I think it's 43. Thanks. And maybe, I guess, you do that too. So as I just wanted to point out, there's been a lot, and that's just a sampling of the work that's been done here. And so I'm going to just give you an overview of some of the historical work on the basin geometry and some of the insights that were done, and then we're going to hear from Paul again on some of the more recent interpretation. Then we're going to compare that from the reports of the others of our current ongoing interpretation versus some of the previous work, and well, we find it pretty interesting, complementary and then not so complementary in places. So, but that's it's all part of the process. So next slide, please. And so this would be, I think, slide 43, but just to get everybody on the phone in tune, it's the slide that has historical basin geometry, Barron, Brock, and Martin, 1991. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here other than to point out this dark stuff up here is basically fine-grained materials, basically Pleistocene lakebed sediments, and then Playa Lake deposits. And then all this white area is coarse-grained. And this is marked the Inyo Kern area, and then Ridgecrest is here, China Lake, so you can kind of orient where that cross-section is. Basically, what Barron, Brock, and Martin came up with, they didn't have a lot of the data we have now, is that they broke it up into basically a shallow and a deep aquifer, and the deeper aquifer unconfined in the west and confined in the east. So those were just some basic things I wanted to point out. So we knew that back in 91. Okay, so next slide. And so now here is the Bureau of Reclamation report, and I know some of the people in the room here were part of that work and reviewed that work, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, but you can see these borehole logs here. And I'm just going to point out, so they use the same colors basically we are, because they're pretty standard. So we have yellow for the coarser grain, and then the dark is for the finer grain material, the clays. And you can see that they found a lot of clay in these boreholes, and they found that the clay is 800 to 1,300 feet thick in a majority of the basin, and sand and gravel valley fill in the southwest portion of the main basin and along the Sierra Nevada mountain. So, and that's where the well fields are now. And then the structural features such as the fault may restrict groundwater flow to the northeast from the El Paso area. So that was known back in 93, and I know there's a lot more that came out of that report, but these are just some of the pertinent ones that I'm hitting on right now. So next slide, please. And then Brown and Caldwell. And apologize for this. We're not sure what happened, but the lines moved, so I'll go into detail on this. But basically, Brown and Caldwell developed a flow model, and that was reported in 2009. That's the same flow model that DRI took and is modified. And that's a groundwater flow model. I want to make a little distinction here. What we're talking about is a hydrogeologic conceptual model. And actually, just let me digress. How many people worked in the oil and gas industry? Okay. So, you know, groundwater, it's been kind of behind the times compared to oil and gas. In the oil and gas industry, you develop a 3D, digital, electronic, hydrogeologic conceptual model, and you put all your data in that. Then you basically upscale the high resolution on the hydrogeologic conceptual model. Then you upscale it, you transform it into a fluid and fate and transport flow model. I worked for Schlumberger for a few years, so that's why. And they had some great tools there, but groundwater has not been doing that, except when you're on these small sites doing contaminant work, they tend to do that more. Sigma basically raises the bar on groundwater management. So this is why the state and Stanford, even the Danish government and some basins are involved in developing a workflow for making it more like the oil and gas industry, doing more detailed analysis in the future. And we think it's important in basins like this, where you're really going to have to really squeeze as much water out of it as you can and look at all the options, a full portfolio menu of options for how are you going to do that. Conservation, recycled water, capturing water where you can, importing water if we can, and then using brackish water. So it's just a whole portfolio of management options. Anyway, back to this. So in Brown and Caldwell's conceptual model, and this is what they built the flow model on, was they really had sort of four main features that they built into it. They called this a clay plug off to the west, and then this was the Playa Lake area, and this was the coarser grained gravel zone in the southwest, and this is that feature that I just mentioned, a restrictive barrier of some sort across the northeast portion of the El Paso area. So they based that, they used that as a basis for then developing this flow model that's 4 layers. Now I just want to point out that what I just said about the 1993 report is different, because what that 1993 report said is that this clay beds were pretty extensive in the basin. So anyway, just pointing that out, and you'll see some more on that. Next slide, please. And then this is actually out of the, I think it's out of the technical justification report actually in 2013. And this, again, here's Salt Wells Valley, by the way. Oh, here's the location of the line. So this is going from Salt Wells Valley up to the northwest corner of the Indian Wells Valley Basin. And here you see 3 hydrogeologic zones. You have the shallow zone, which is more coarse-grained, you know, sands and gravels, the Playa Lake over here. And then you have this deeper zone. Here's this thicker zone of finer grained materials, and you see how extensive it is, going from here to here. And then you have the deep zone, which is more coarse grained materials. And so those were some of the main things that we picked out of this report when you look at it. And so, next slide, please. And this is actually out of the Tetra Tech EMI 2003 Basin Report. And really what I'm continuing to point out, if you hadn't noticed, is here again we have a shallow zone. This brown stuff is the finer grained, the Pleistocene lake bed sediments. And then you have more coarse grained material under that. Now, here's the first diagram going across here. Here's the Playa Lake. And so that's this diagram. The second one is here. That's this diagram, and the third one is down here. And what you see as you move south in the basin is this thick, finer grain unit thins and then disappears. And so it's gone over here. And so I think that's very important. And if you think about the way, if you know anything about the history here, you had this depositional environment of a series of lakes that when the glaciers melted, a bunch of sediments and were just washed through the basin down into swirls. And there were periods of large lakes. And that's the other thing that's on this that you may not be able to see as well, is there are shorelines mapped out of the old lake that was here back in the Pleistocene times. So the other thing I want to point out is you may be able to see these green lines in here. Those are sand stringers, sand and gravel stringers. So this is not just all fine grained material, but it's got some pretty conductive material in it. So this is basically a big storage zone here. Clays can take a lot more water than sands and gravels. They're much more porous, so it stores a lot of water. And it has sand in it. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at. But so extensive Pleistocene lake bed clay in largely the northern portion of the zone. And so that's I think pretty much what I'm going to cover. Next slide. Oh, finally, geologic maps. So I mentioned these maps. So these are faults mapped by the USGS and then the California Geological Survey. And so you have major fault zones, the Little Lake Fault and the Airport Lake Fault. This kind of coalesces or converges with the Little Lake, but you see all these faults. And then over here you even see more faults. And this is a pretty large scale, 1 to 250,000 map, I think. So it's not that like the detail of a Trona sheet. But that was back in 60. So, and then you have the Sierra Nevada frontal fault. And basically this basin formed when the Sierra Nevada started really moving up, and it formed a half graben, and a tremendous amount of sediments got dumped in here. The other thing I want to point out here is you see the difference in color of these two zones? We're going to talk about this a little bit more. The main basin is recent alluvium. This is mapped either as, depending on which map you look at, older alluvium or Pleistocene non-marine sediments. And this little group of sediment of this geologic formation down here is actually the Ricardo Formation. Anybody been to Red Rock Canyon? So, beautiful. And that's actually Ricardo Formation, which has been tilted by uplift from the El Paso Mountains. It's tilted to the west. And it is volcaniclastic in the lower part of that formation, and it's fluvial dominated in the upper part, or, you know, water lane, rivers and alluvial materials. And what's really interesting about that is, so it's daylighting here, but we find it in the bottom of the unconsolidated sediments over here. So it's we really are seeing a different kind of a geologic setting in these two basins, I think is what I'm trying to say. So just food for thought. And I think at that point I'm going to turn it back over to Paul. Yes. So thank you.
Okay, after going through the historical data, I'm just going to go through what we're calling the basin geometry. But this is just mainly what I want to do here is just give you an overview of the profiles that we're looking through across the basin and a little bit of what we see with regard to the data. And maybe look at the initial interpretations as we go along. Now this slide that we're looking at, the profile is up in the northern, across the northern part of the basin, directly east-west. And you can see the SkyTem data. We have a couple of TDS measurements. And the importance of the TDS measurements are the TDS shows that it's fresh water below 1,000 milligrams per liter. of total dissolved solids, and that tells us that our SkyTem signal is going to be more related to the lithology rather than salinity. So the signal in SkyTem will be less with regard to the salinity up here. And what we can see, of course, is along the Sierra Nevada frontal fault, we have a relatively low depth of investigation, and we can see the orange and yellow colors, which indicates, again, we have primarily sands and gravels right along the fault. Then the resistivities increase as you get towards the middle of the basin, so you have a lot of more finer materials in the middle. So this will be maybe a middle zone, for example. And then when you get out into the Playa Lake area, you can see the resistivity increases, and that is probably, we have no TDS data to verify it, but that could possibly be due to both a combination of lithology, but especially up here due to salinity, higher TDS. Next slide. And so we go into the middle of the basin, and again, this gives you a good example of the granite from the SkyTem. And then we have the unsaturated zone that becomes thinner, but we have an unsaturated zone. And we have some higher or lower resistivities, finer materials here, which is confirmed by the TDS with low TDS. So we know that the SkyTem here is due to lithology and not TDS. And then we have an area with coarser materials in between an area with finer materials. So that's kind of interesting. And then the TDS we have here, we have higher TDS, of course, in the Playa Lake area, where we have the brackish water. Next slide. Now we're in the El Paso area, and even though we have relatively good data coverage on SkyTem in the El Paso area, I wanted to bring this slide up because now we're going across the El Paso area, kind of perpendicular to the Sierra Nevada frontal fault. And what we see is each of the individual SkyTem lines, because our SkyTem was run perpendicular. So we don't have solid SkyTem data in that direction, but we have it just kind of limited here. But we can still see some general tendencies within the SkyTem data where we have relatively thick, high resistive or low resistivities, and then when we get into the area here, we have relatively higher resistivities. Yeah. Yeah, and then, of course, we have some lower resistivities right here, right along the Sierra Nevada frontal fault. And again, we have the lower resistivities that come all the way to the frontal fault. And then, of course, you can see the granites within the mountain range there. Next slide. Now, this takes the entire basin from the southwest to the northeast. And here you can see something that begins to be a little interesting. When we take the El Paso section of the basin, you can really see the thick, relatively low resistivities, and then up at the top part where we have the unsaturated zone, the higher resistivities. But the moment we get out of the El Paso area, then all of a sudden you see a change in the sedimentation. And so you have an area where the resistivities are relatively high and you have coarse-grained materials. And you can see that when you're looking at the TDS within the wells, because the TDS in this area is also very low. So we know that the sky temp is due to lithology. When we get out underneath the Playa Lake, you can see that our TDS becomes relatively high, well over 3,000 milligrams per liter. And we start getting into the very dark blue colors. And there we have probably the resistivities related more towards the brackish water, and also probably a combination of lithology, but definitely brackish water is coming in and having an influence on our SkyTem data. Next slide. So that's just to kind of get an idea of what the basin looks like and how the data changes across the basin. What I want to do now is go through kind of what can we see with regard to structural features within the basin, the faults and potential hydrologic barriers. Now we have, of course, mapped the surface faults, and previous reports have named the different barriers. So we're interested to see, can we see the same features within our data? And we also want to see if the AEM data can give us new insights into these features. How do these features affect, for example, the brackish water or the hydrology within the basin? And one of the things that I need to iterate here is, in what I'm showing you now, we only mapped the faults that we can see. So, next slide. And for those following at home, I don't know if it's slide 49, but this is the slide of the faults where it says orientation west to east, and it's in the northern part of the basin. And when we look at the SkyTem data, we see something interesting. We can see a definite change in our lithology here. And this change in lithology occurs between two already mapped faults. So it indicates that there's something going on between these faults that have changed the depositional environment. So we have coarser materials between these two faults right up here. It looks like there may also be another fault affecting the deposition. We have some coarser material that's coming up here and then some finer material. But then to the west of that fault, we start getting into the thick layers of finer sediments. So we potentially have another fault here. And then, of course, we can see the Sierra Nevada frontal fault. I won't go into much detail on that because that's probably the most obvious within the basin. And just a note here as well, along the frontal fault, again, we have a lot of coarse materials here, and you don't see the finer materials within the SkyTem data. Okay, next slide. So this is just a little bit further south, and we're looking at some more other faults, and it looks like that our faults might be affecting the upper zone as well. Here, where between these two faults, the upper zone appears to be becoming thicker, and then here it looks like we have potentially an upwelling of more saline water with higher TDS. And these two faults correspond with these two faults that were mapped on the surface. One of the interesting points, now we have the depth of investigation right here. But when you look under the depth of investigation, it looks like we see a signal here to the east of the fault. We're still uncertain, but it looks like that on this side of the fault we might have less saline water and maybe coarser materials deposited under the Playa Lake area here. So that's something that we want to look into even more and see if we can get to the bottom of that. So this is an initial finding here. Next slide. And again, with the faults here, we can see at this fault, there appears to... I may have used up all of your battery. Oh, it's back. So it looks like might have to go old school then. It looks like it's getting thicker here. And that corresponds with this fault right here. And then again, similar to the last slide, it looks like we have, even though our depth of investigation is fairly not so deep, it looks like we have some sort of signal indicating maybe fresher water coming up here, or at least coarser sediments that come down. But again, we're not sure. This is the signal that we're seeing within the SkyTem data. Yeah, next slide. And again, we're going between these two faults right here. Now we're approaching the southern part of the main basin. And again, we can see these two faults that are already mapped out. And then we have coarser materials in between these two faults. So we can see that there's a general trend here where it looks like the faults are affecting our depositional environment. Next slide. And so now we're going from the southwest to the northeast, just right on the edge of the El Paso basin here, and moving northeast. So we're looking at it in a different direction. And again, it seems like we can see the different faults that are affecting the resistivity, where our coarser materials again become thicker in between these two faults here. And here our depth of investigation is quite low, or quite deep. So we're pretty certain of the signal that we're seeing here. Next slide. And this is a wider perspective where we're going from the El Paso section near the frontal fault and across right here is at what we call kind of the neck area, the transition between the main basin and the El Paso basin. And here again we can see there's a definite signal within the SkyTem data. We can see that we have a lot of TDS in this well right here, which is fresh water. So we know that these green and blue-green colors are due to finer materials, which we can see extend all the way up into the El Paso. And then you have the faulting here. And in between these faults, so this fault will be right here, and then this next fault here is this fault, which probably extends down a little bit further south. And then we can follow another fault here. We have finer grain materials here and coarser grain materials here. And this fault is this fault right here. And so you can kind of see the faulting within the SkyTem data. Next slide. So with that, those are the initial interpretations. I think what I'd like to say and finish it up, and I didn't put this on the slide, but these are the initial interpretations. There's a number of things that I want to do before we finalize this. The first thing is I want to start scouring the seismic data and seeing the faults at depth within the seismic data and see how they correlate with the SkyTem faults. And I want to go in and start looking at, in extreme detail, the SkyTem data and seeing how these faults also correlate spatially. And then we can start to tie these faults together and see and use it to affect how we look at and delineate the basin. So those are kind of the next steps that I would like to do, or that's on my to-do list.
So at this point we have another break, and I would first ask Greg or Heather on the phone, any comments or input?
Yeah, I can. I just have a quick question.
Okay.
Feedback. It's my slide 44. It's basin geometry. It says middle basin, and it's an orientation from west to east.
Yeah.
The question is, in the center of the basin there, I'm seeing what appears the lithology is showing predominantly clay all the way up to the surface, but the resistivity is showing a transition zone. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay, you're in the middle basin.
Can we see that also on the slide? What slide number?
Yes, it's orientation west to east. It's pretty much dead center in the basin going through Ridgecrest.
Yeah. It's the one you're referring to is the second slide in the basin geometry series?
That's correct. Second section, second cross section.
Okay. I think that's going to be our slide number 47. Can we move to that on the presentation on the board? Yeah, I think 3 slides back. Okay, good. So your question refers to the SkyTem data here, where if you see the symbol DOI here, and the well, the deepest well here shows kind of fine-grained materials, whereas in the middle it indicates that there's some coarser-grained materials at the bottom and at the top, whereas it kind of fingers out, according to the SkyTem data, in the middle. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that deepest well, at least I think it's showing that it's predominantly finer grained material all the way to the surface.
Yeah.
But the resistivity appears to change.
Yeah, right.
And there's also that well with the gray. I'm not sure what gray represents.
Yeah, the gray represents a fill right here. So we basically don't know. And then underneath it has sand. I'm not too certain about this well, but the deep well, which shows a lot of the finer grained, but you have the red resistivity up in the upper layers. And that red resistivity is interpreted as being the unsaturated zone. So even if it is finer grained materials, because it's unsaturated, it'll still come back with relatively high resistivities. But you can see that the resistivities are maybe a little more orange in color. And that orange in color will be because it's unsaturated clay materials, which will have a lower resistivity, but still relatively high resistivity.
Okay, so the water table would be roughly at the bottom of the red zone then?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody in the audience have a comment?
Stefan. Paul, I may have missed how you determine the depth of investigation, but my question really is, I've noticed several slides, and this is not a bad slide to look at. There is often a trend where below your depth of investigation, there's an indication of a higher resistivity often. And do you think that's a trend with SkyTim? Is that maybe an artifact, or?
It could be an artifact, and that's where I would really like to have more deeper wells, so that we can either confirm it or not. And that's why anytime you start looking at interpreting below the depth of investigation, you really have to be careful. And so the deeper wells, like the one that we have here on this slide here, are critical. And here you can see the SkyTem, where we have predominantly clay materials here. Below the depth of investigation, the SkyTem actually remains the same color as above. So it doesn't look like the depth of the investigation has affected the resistivity right around that well. But that being said, you still need to be careful about over-interpreting, especially below the depth of investigation. And that's one of the things that I'm aware of and trying not to do.
Thank
you. Stan Rotora. I may be getting ahead of your story, and if I am, I'll sit down. But I'm curious. This is a question rather than a comment or an input. The water district has for several years been trying to relocate some of their wells to be in areas which will not impact some of the shallower wells, and I'm hoping that the Navy is doing something equivalent, although I don't think we have any insight into that right now. May I ask, does this data that you're gathering now and the results that you have, is that going to eventually give us some insight into where we should be locating our deeper wells so that they don't impact the other wells as much? Or am I reading too much into this?
I think you can use this data in order to look at the possibilities of locating into deeper freshwater resources. Of course, you're going to have to use a flow model and make sure that it's not going to impact the shallower wells as well. But yeah, I think some of the examples might be looking at the faulting within the system, and if we see a signal like this where we may have some deeper freshwater, that this could be a place of interest to explore. But again, it would be the first step.
I don't remember the slide number, but you did show a section that is east-west, and it's north considerably from where the section you have on your screen is right now. And it would have crossed through the what Brown and Caldwell called the clay plug, which is a very significant and obvious feature that I didn't see hardly any hint of in your SkyTem data. The TDS there is about, in that 1,400 foot thick section of clay, is around 3,000 ppm.
Yeah. I don't know if that's the previous slide. Yeah, I believe it's the previous slide. If we can move back to the previous slide. Number 46. Oh, I can use the clicker to go back now. Didn't even. Is this the slide you're referring to?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Of course, we don't have any TDS, but I know the TDS that you're referring to is up around in this area.
No, it's further west. And
Okay.
actually, you do have TDS. Deal Ranch 1 and 2 that were done at the same time as the
Yeah.
Bureau Rec study.
We have 3 TDS studies here, or measurements here, but the one that's kind of on top as the lithology changes, that has a TDS between about 500 and 1,000 milligrams per liter. So it's not so high.
Well, I don't know, there's some kind of discrepancy here. You know, one of the problems that we've got sitting in the audience is that a lot of the detail, even with really good eyes, is not visible.
Yeah.
And even the scale of depth there is not, is not visible. So a lot of the questions that we might have are imperfectly stated for lack of being able to see. That thick clay section starts at about 400 feet below ground level and penetrates on down to about 1,800 feet.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really prominent feature, and its aerial extent is substantial.
Yeah.
Okay, so show it to me on your SkyTem.
That's what we would see right here.
Well, it does not extend arbitrarily to the east. It has an extent. We don't know what the east-west width is. It does have a fairly abrupt termination to the west, it appears. It pinches out, though. It doesn't abruptly stop. The best, but it doesn't look like that in the wells that have penetrated it. It pinches out more gradually instead of abruptly. And on the other end, we don't really know. But it does not extend, as far as we know, clear on to the east, unremitted as it shows in the TEM data. So, I think there's a question there, and I'm sure as you investigate this further, you will maybe have some better understanding of what's going on. I'm just pointing out this. I don't know that it's a discrepancy, but I guess I'm a little disappointed that clay that gave so many people through the decades so much misery, literally, that it doesn't show up more. Yes, it's more localized like that.
And so, and that's the question, of course, that we got to keep in mind is the SkyTem shows a deep signal. And we just need to make sure, again, that the signal is due to lithology and what part of the signal is due to the water, the TDS.
Yeah, sure.
So we'll go back and look at that data.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether that particular data is in. It's not showing up there. So again, that's we're still continuing to sort out the data, Don, as I mentioned.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, appreciate you.
But that's one of the features that has, say at least partially known aerial extent. North-south it goes approximately from the 395 overpass. Bureau Rec Well 10 shows distinct evidence of that clay, but it's discontinuous and is not as thick. So it's disappearing as you go north, and you can say Bureau Rec 10 is kind of the northern limit.
Yeah.
So you should be able to see that variation with your SkyTem passes. If you pick the right tracks to look at, you should be able to see that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're going to go. We've begun to go in detail. We've done it, but when we go through and look at steps along the basin, what I've shown is just kind of snippets with a long distance between the profiles, but we take it at small steps so that we can get a 3D picture. And we can also take it in the north-south and even the different directions. But we'll definitely look at that and make sure that our interpretation is the proper one.
Yeah, it's got
as good as possible anyway.
Well, it has to be consistent with what we physically observe, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost 11 o'clock, and we've got, what slide are we on? 55, and we've got to 99, so just to give everybody a heads up. Okay. That's where we're at, right?
Yeah. And I think with the summary, so basically what we're saying is that we're trying to use, again, the SkyTem AEM data with all the available data, so that, including the seismic gravity, borehole lithology, water level, water chemistry, in order to, again, see what we can see. The AEM will more accurately map the features, such as the faults. I think we can see a lot of the faults within there. But again, we want to look at the seismic and other data to continue to corroborate the AEM findings. And the other thing, what Tim pointed out earlier, is that the El Paso area is mapped as Pleistocene non-marine sediments at the surface, and there appears in the AEM data to be a definite geological difference between El Paso area and the rest of the basin. However, in the El Paso area, our data is actually limited with a few wells and very few TDS measurements. So any additional data that we can get, especially in that area, would be really good. So now we're getting into more interpretation of our HCM based upon what we see from the SkyTem data. And in general, what we can see from the SkyTem data that we presented is three basic zones. The general, relative, of course, we're lumping things together. We have to keep that in mind. But similar to, for example, the Tri-Eco Tetra Tech report, it does look like the SkyTem is showing a general three-zone situation, where we have a shallow zone, which we're calling the HGZ1, the intermediate zone, HGZ2, and the deeper zone, HGZ3. When we get over towards the frontal fault, in a portion of the area, there's direct hydrological contact between Zone 1 and Zone 3. I've put this in question marks because it's unsure where we should draw this. And in fact, it probably should be coming up so that the Zone 1 is thinner. But that's something that we're still working at and adjusting along the way. So what are these zones? And from, go ahead and next slide. The general observations that we've had and what we're defining the HG Zone 1 as the shallow zone, that's going to be pretty much the unsaturated zone, where the generally have the high resistivities, and then you have the saturated zone with sand and gravel. So you have also little coarser material. And the data that we're seeing this in, of course, is the lithological descriptions, the SkyTem data, and the electrical logs. Go ahead and next. So zone 2 is generally a saturated zone, and this is units with the finer materials and the lower hydraulic conductivity. However, like Tim mentioned before, we do see some sand units within the well lithology. So it's not pure clay or clay materials. There's also layers. We can see the layers of sand. But in general, and this is what the SkyTem data with the blue and green colors are showing us, is that this zone tends to have the lower hydraulic conductivities or the finer sediments. The bottom of the zone can be uncertain because there's fewer and fewer wells that penetrate this bottom, and the SkyTem data, especially the depth of investigation, makes this in certain areas a little more uncertain. So it all depends on what the data is and how certain we are of where this zone is. Next slide. And so the zone 3, this can be a combination of the unconsolidated, deeper, unconsolidated sands and gravels, or the semi-consolidated, or the consolidated sandstone, for example, or conglomerate. And this is defined where it comes up towards the surface with the higher resistivities. The problem is we become, due to lack of data that's extending this deep, this zone actually becomes, to differentiate it, it becomes more uncertain. So our uncertainty, the deeper we get, becomes greater. So that's all right. We go to the next slide. So we've seen these cross sections before, and now I just want to kind of pull it together where we have the different zones. So here's the line that we have for zone 1, and you can see we have the higher resistivities and probably predominantly unsaturated zone. And then we have the clays and the finer materials where it's quite thick here. And of course, this is based largely on the SkyTem data. And then we're uncertain about where this boundary is here, but it could be higher based upon the resistivity, but we're a little uncertain about that. So the next slide, as we go down again, and here we have hydrogeologic zone 1, which is, as we go down further south in the basin, which is thicker, and you can see this also in the wells, where you have a lot of sandy materials, and then zone 2, where you have clay materials a lot in the wells here. And again, here you have the resistivities. That's showing that as well. And then in between here, you have something going on in between the two faults, where it appears that we have coarser materials in between the two faults. And then in the El Paso Basin, because it's a different geology, we're calling it instead Zone A, Zone B, and Zone 3, but we're uncertain. But we can see that the middle zone of the finer materials is much thicker, and that this zone is probably more likely an unsaturated zone rather than coarse materials. And we're very uncertain about this third zone, whether it even exists in the El Paso Basin area. Next slide. And so this is what it looks like across the entire basin. And again, the El Paso area, we have a lot of the finer sediments. And then once we get into the fault, we have the thicker sediments, and then zone 1, and then under the Playa Lake, zone 2 becomes thicker, and then we have zone 3 with an uncertainty as to where the actual boundary is there. Next slide. So we can make some isopac maps on the thickness of these zones, and you can see that zone 1 we have mapped out thicker in the west, thinner in the east, especially under the Playa Lake, and then right on the other side we have thicker zone 1 right in the middle of the basin, right after the El Paso, the boundary to the El Paso. Next slide. If we look at zone 2, I think this is one of the most interesting maps because we can see in zone 2 that in the western part, right along the frontal fault, it's absent. And that's where we have direct hydrological contact between the shallow zone 1 and the deeper zone 3. And then it thickens out. And the way that we've mapped it is here we have the lacustrine deposits, and then the clay plug would be here, and then it's absent here. And the lacustrine deposits, the finer deposits, go down here. Then it thins out again here where we see coarser materials. So this is the boundary of the lacustrine deposits, whereas here we have the finer alluvial and alluvial deposits that come down on this side. Next slide. And this is zone 3. I'm not going to go too much in detail because just of the uncertainty of how thick it actually is. But one thing that we can see is that it appears that it thins out the further east that we go. So I think, go ahead, next slide. So looking at a brief summary of the basin hydrogeology, again, we've used AEM and the lithology of the wells that we have as a primary mapping function. This is going to be updated the more wells that we get in. So that's why it's important that we continue to update this as we find more coordinates, for example, to the deeper wells and get them incorporated in. We also need to define the bottom of the basement better, and when we get more well information, then we can begin to really look at the seismic and get a better hold of the bottom of our basement. I want to point out again that the main Indian Wells Valley Basin is different, and we can see that in the data that we have, specifically the AEM data, and that we need more data from El Paso to really understand that part of the basin. And then finally, the 3 hydrogeologic units that we can see in the Indian Wells Basin, they're corroborated with other studies and other available data. The shallow unit composed of alluvium and playa deposits tend to be coarser, and in the unsaturated zone, intermediate units are lake deposits, silts, and clays, with some interbedded sands that. And then once we get into the southern part of the basin, it's composed of finer alluvium. And then, of course, the deep unit is composed of alluvium and sandstones and conglomerates. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Tim, who will look at a comparison with the previous studies.
Okay, so I'm going to skip through the references quite quickly because I already went over these before, but you'll see some comparative work in terms of a comparison of the hydrogeologic zones that Paul just went over with some of the cross sections. That's one of the things we can do with the 3D. The 3D context is draw lines in it and show where those cross sections existed by registering them in place based on the existing reports. So you'll see what I'm talking about anyway. Next slide. And next slide. And then, so here's the comparison of the reports that you're going to see. And next slide. And so I showed this earlier, and this is from Baron, Brock, and Martin. And again, so they had two aquifer systems, a shallow aquifer, which was mapped with this Pleistocene clay bed here, the Playa Lake, and then largely alluvial deposits here, so deep and shallow. And then here is the undulating line that marks the bottom of the shallow aquifer in the hydrogeologic conceptual model. Here's zone 2, and then below this, we're not sure where the bottom of the deeper zone is, I think as Paul mentioned earlier. So you can see it's not a bad batch compared to the earlier work. And and it shows the different data that we've got there. But anyway, so they didn't have a lot of data out here to infer how long this, how far this finer grained sediment extended. So next slide. And this shows a cartoon of what that looks like. And here's the squiggly line, and here's our HZ2 again, and then the shallow and the deep. So that was just a cartoon of the previous one. Thank you, Ryan, who marked those up. Anyway, in the next slide. And so here's another cross-section from Baron, Brock, and Martin. And this time it's going from the north to the south, or south to north, however you want to put it. And this shows a much thicker zone where it's more fine-grained. And you can see, I'll just outline this. Here's our shallow, the bottom of our shallow zone, and the bottom of our intermediate zone. So it matches up pretty good here again. Again, it didn't extend out as far to the south as what we mapped. But again, it's a pretty reasonable match even for those old the old work that was done. So next slide. And here's a mock-up of that again with the shallow and deep aquifer as compared to what we did. So next slide. And then this is out of Monastero. So this is actually a combination of seismic line and gravity they used to map the bottom of the basin, along with snort 1 and snort 2. And on top of this, we've drawn our shallow, the bottom of our shallow aquifer right here, and our intermediate zone, and then our deeper zone. And a couple of things I wanted to point out here is, so this is where we actually have a bottom of the basement map that we can pull into the model. And this has been determined to be, and I mentioned this earlier, Ricardo Formation, which again, it's at the bottom of our basin, in the main basin, but it's outcropping and tilted over in the El Paso area, which is kind of interesting. And this is, it's not actually magma, it's ferromagnesium concentration there, so just a very heavy metals there. But again, you can see some of the SkyTem data, and these are the snort wells that Paul showed the lithology of earlier. And then there's some these little dark lines are actually basalts that have been mapped with the seismic data. So again, this was determined from the seismic data. Now we're still trying to get, we've gotten images of the seismic lines. I think we've gotten pretty well all of them. We don't have, we're still trying to find out where the, paper. A lot of papers out there. And so we're trying to get our hands on the actual seismologist interpretation. We've seen a little bit of scribbling, but that's one of the big, I think, differences I want to point out again, just to reinforce, is that what we're doing here is we're bringing everything into electronic format where it can be looked at time and time again, and as new data is brought in electronic format, it's already there. You don't have to go look up an old report or dig it up. We'll have it there to continue to use that valuable information that's been collected over decades. So anyway, with that, next slide. And then here's a comparison with something that came out of the DRI 2016, and so here again we have the dark is the Pleistocene lakebed deposits, lacustrine deposits, and then over here it's mapped as alluvium, and on top of that we've overlaid SkyTem data and borehole data, a little bit of borehole data, and then here's our shallow zone, the light line, and then here's our second zone, the bottom of our second zone, where it's largely finer grained material, so it's mapped as alluvium out here. And I know one thing I want to point out, I know Greg's on the phone and with DRI, and that model is continuing to be worked on and updated, so it's a work in progress. This is out of 2016, and we really don't know what the current hydrologic distribution is, hydraulic conductivity distribution is in the model, because it keeps evolving. So, but this is out of a 2016 report. So next slide. And then we have the TriEcho 2013. Here's another diagram, and this, again, so this is the northwest to the southeast, and we showed this earlier. It's the Salt Wells Valley out in the bottom, and this is going from basically here to here up to the northwest part of the basin. And so, again, they mapped 3 hydrogeologic units, and you can see the comparison with the lines that we've drawn. Here's the bottom of our first unit, matches really well with theirs, and then here's the bottom of our unit, and this has something to do, this little weird bend here has something to do with the bend in the map, so it kind of distorts the look of it, but again, I think it's a pretty good match when you look at it, pretty good comparison. Next slide. Oh, and the faulting, yes, thanks, Paul. And then here's the orientation from south to north. And again, you can see the match of the shallow zone compared to the second zone, which is again in finer grained with the display of the boreholes and all that. And you can see that our line goes down a little further to the south than was mapped here, but it's still not a bad comparison. And we're going to continue to refine this, so who knows, maybe it'll end up a little closer, but again, it's a very good comparison, I think, compared to the more recent work done by the base. And here's a map of here's the layers out of the 2016 model, and just for the colors, the beige is conductivity, it's log 10 feet per day, 2 times that, so, and then yellow is lower, and then the blue is actually lower. So, again, here's our shallow zone laid on top of it, and you can see there's a bit of difference in the top. In the middle, we have a more extensive zone than what's mapped in the, and that's our hydrogeologic unit 2, and then the bottom goes down quite a bit further. So you can see that there's a bit of a difference here in our interpretation with the combined data than what's in the model layers. So just wanted to, I think that's our last example if I'm not. Yeah, so then I just wanted to summarize the comparison with the historic reports. And so in some areas compares relatively well with the historic reports. the 3 hydrogeologic units visible in the AEM data, and those corroborate well with other available reports, especially the 2003 comprehensive base-wide hydrogeologic report and the 2013 reports. And then the faults seem to be pretty accurately located and corroborated with the data. And then in some areas, the SkyTem data shows some differences. The Brown and Caldwell I seem to be looking at it a little different, and we're going to look into this, as Don pointed out, with the clay plug. And then the DRI model, the zone of lower hydrologic conductivity associated with the Pleistocene lakebed sediment seems a little more limited than what we've mapped, and the clay plug as well. So SkyTem AE data show this not to be the case, so we've got some additional work both to go back and look at those reports, as well as continuing to bring more data and to do additional evaluation. But anyway, I think that's pretty much it for me on this. Oh, one more. Oh, I wanted to go back. That's right, the Trona sheet. So again, the Trona and the California Geological Survey maps show this main basin to be mapped as, younger materials, younger alluvium. And over in the El Paso area, it's older materials. And this seems to correlate with the AEM data. We're seeing a different resistivity picture over there. As Paul pointed out, along the Sierra Nevada, the frontal fault zone, along the Sierra Nevada, you see a lot more coarse-grained sediments. The colors are much more fiery, oranges and yellows. You go over along the Sierra Nevada fault zone in the El Paso area, you don't see as much of that. Maybe a little different structural regime. I mentioned the El Paso area, the El Paso Mountains moving up and tilting the Ricardo Formation off to the west. I think that has something to do with what we're seeing. And the other thing is the El Paso area has not been extensively studied because there's not a lot of people over there, for one thing. There's not a city and a base to do a lot of this work, and data are sparse. So I think that's something that we're going to be looking into in the future a little bit more. So next slide. And this just shows actually, not a very nice picture, but this is the yellow, the alluvium, the younger alluvium of the main basin. Here's the northeast end of the El Paso area, and you can see it's a different color, and this is what we were pointing out from the earlier map. So, and that's off the Trona sheet. Oh, and so I think that's it for me. Any questions or comments?
Yes, I have a suggestion. My suggestion is that you are calling Zone 2 the intermediate area. For many years, the intermediate area, as in regards to water, refers to that area, groundwater area, just west of the city limits. In order to not further confuse the general public who might take more interest in this when you get your final report, I suggest you call your Zone 2 something other than intermediate. It's just a suggestion for clarity, for clarity to those folks who aren't following this chapter by chapter.
Okay, thanks, Judy.
Peggy Breeden. One of the questions that I have is regarding the Ricardo formations that you identified there. I remember about 25 years ago when Ken Turner was with the Kern County Water Agency, he brought up those Ricardo formations and alluded to the fact that there might be significant water in that area. Were you able to find any of that from the data you received, or validate any of his conjecture?
No, I wasn't aware of that, Peggy, but, we actually have had a few conversations about that. It's very permeable materials. And so, it's possible that, off to the west, there may be some sort of a supply there to look at. It'd be relatively deep. I know there was a very old oil and gas well that was drilled down in the southern end of the basin that I think hit what they considered a potential supply of water quite deep, several thousand feet deep. So, but there was no water quality sampling with that, and they abandoned that well because it produced no oil or gas. So
maybe we could look at it and see if it works with what you're finding now, because if indeed there is significant water, what the quality was, he said that he had no idea, but just said it was an indicator of significant water.
Okay.
So maybe we can look at that data. I'm sure the water district still has it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. And what was the guy's name?
Ken Turner.
Ken Turney. Thanks.
Yeah, Ken Turner was with the Kern County Water Agency. He was their staff geologist for many years. You're seeing relatively coarse material in the El Paso Basin. That's how you're interpreting your SkyTem tracks?
No, I think it's finer material.
All right, I would agree with that. Yeah. The Ricardo Formation is Miocene, and a lot of the alluvium that's in the El Pasos, of course, has been derived from the sediments that are there, right there, close by. Right. So when you drill, it's not totally obvious sometimes whether you're drilling really in Ricardo Formation or whether it's sediment derived that's been cemented, derived from it. When Burek Well 1 was drilled, which is right to the north of the El Paso Basin area, the drilling became ever more difficult, slower, and I don't know now, I can't remember quite how many bits were used up in that hole. The well was finally bottomed out at 1980 or thereabouts feet because the rate of progress was effectively stopped. And at that point, it was, I would say, based on cuttings, we were in continental sediment. My comments on your presentation, I think you guys have managed to pull together a lot of material, and you're further along than I thought you would be. And so I give you a gold star on your chart, and I'm sincere when I say that. However, the interpretation part of it, how we relate to the geology, is another tough one. The old geologic maps recognize the Pleistocene lacustrine deposits at China Lake. That so-called clay plug is not just some sort of that kind of sounds ugly, actually. It's Pleistocene also, and it is directly connected to the lake sediment that we recognize clearly. But the clay content varies; it changes, and it's really high organic clay to the west, and then as you go to the east, the clay content varies some, but the organic content drops way away, and the water quality changes depending on the deposition. And the thing that I have offered to the TAC and to individuals is that much of our water here was deposited in Pleistocene times based on age and lithography. And our old ideas that we had significant recharge from the Sierra, all of that needs to be looked at very carefully, but you need to have all of the various possible pieces and somehow rationalize, understand what the data we have actually means.
Definitely agree.
Anyone else? Okay. Anything on the phone?
Yeah, just a quick question. It's my slide 78. It's a north to south section labeled CC prime. Maybe you could go to that one. My question has to do with in the shallower sediments, you have that as your shallow zone, which I believe you're calling coarse sediments. Is that section going through the China Lake Playa itself, or is it off to the perhaps west?
Yeah, I think it might be catching the edge of the playa. It looks like it, but it's hard to tell from looking at this right here.
Okay, I wasn't sure from the map, but clearly that would be fine grade sediments in the playa area.
Yeah, they should be finer grained. Yep.
But I think in the middle of the section, it should thin out the top section like it does in the Triaco Tetra Tech. And I think that's right probably in the middle of the China Lake. But when you see some of the wells to the left-hand side of the section, you can see that the materials are actually sand and coarser grained. And then in the middle, they get finer grained along those lines. So I think the Playa Lake is actually probably in the middle of that section. And then you can see the elevation increases. And as the elevation increases, you have the coarser sediments. And I think that's what we're seeing in our interpretation as well.
That makes sense, but you're not arguing that you have coarse sediments in the playa, are you?
What's that? Sorry?
Are you suggesting there are coarse sediments in the playa proper?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Final part.
Okay. Yeah. I'll just finish off with some of our initial results from the TDS, and we kind of compare it with also the geology. One of the things that I want to point out is that, again, this is preliminary, and there's a number of things which I'll end with what we want to do with this data in order to get deeper into identifying where we have potential sources of brackish water that we can take advantage of, because this is what we're really interested in. So if I begin here, this is our slide 88. That's the first of the brackish water distribution slides. This is just showing where we have all of the TDS data available. This is, of course, the main basin, and then there's a single measurement in the El Paso region. So it's kind of hard to see, but I try to zoom in a little bit just to show you the detail that we're going to look at. The triangles, of course, the lower TDSs are the blue colors. Green is 500 to 1,000 milligrams per liter. Yellow is 1,000 to 3,000, and red is over 3,000. The triangles are the shallow wells that are in our Zone 1. The circles are the medium depth wells, which are in our Zone 2, and the squares are the deeper wells, which are in our Zone 3. So we can kind of begin to look at how the TDS changes within these hydrogeologic zones that we've mapped out. Next slide. And so what we've preliminarily done is simply interpolated the measurements per zone. And this is the zone number 1. I think at home these slides, if you're looking at home, these slides might have gotten out of order, the last 3, so you might have to jump 3 slides ahead. But this is the interpolation where you can see that under the Playa Lake we have the highest concentrations, and then we have the lowest concentrations a little bit towards the west, and in the center part of the valley of the basin. Next slide. Yeah, good. And this is Zone 2. And of course, you can see a similar sort of concentration interpolation, where under the Playa Lake we have the highest concentrations and the lowest concentrations in the middle, and again out west. And the next slide. And this is the deeper wells, and we've only interpolated where we have data. And one of our goals, of course, is to try to use both the lithology and the SkyTem data to see what we can to supplement the data that we have here. We don't have too many measurements of the deeper wells, but we have some that we can make the initial interpolations. Now, when we compare this with the isopachite, next slide. One of the things that we found, if we look at the isopach map of our Zone 2, that where our Zone 2 is the thinnest, that's where our TDS tends to be the lowest. So, of course, you have the Playa Lake deposits where the Zone 2 is the thickest, and that's where we tend to have the highest TDS. And this is TDS in actually Zone 1, but this is where we have, of course, the Playa Lake deposits here. Next slide. It becomes even more obvious when we look at Zone 2, where we have the thinnest amount of hydrogeologic Zone 2. That's when we have, we can see the lowest TDS. And then the Playa Lake deposits, we have the highest TDS, extremely high TDS, very close to the fault, extending west. And so this is what we need to also take in mind, of course, when we're doing the model. And the final slide. And again, we can see this in the deeper aquifer. The deeper aquifer tends to be fresher in this area in the middle and west, and then more saline, where we have a thicker hydrogeologic Zone 2. Whether there's a correlation, it's most likely because we have the Playa Lake deposits that's affecting the TDS measurements. Next slide. And we can see this a bit in the SkyTem. And this is what we want to do more of in the future. This is our next step, is we want to take the SkyTem data and see if we can't supplement our TDS to try to identify where we have brackish water. So, for example, here we have a measurement with 1400, and we can see that it has the greener colors up here. Potentially we have even more brackish water with the darker blue colors here. So the brackish water, the TDS is probably increasing in this direction. And we can see we have relatively high TDS measurements, 8,000, 9,000 milligrams per liter, and the dark blue colors. So what we want to try to do is scour through and see how we can combine this in order to supplement our TDS map, so we can begin to point out where we have brackish water. And then another step also, they mentioned in the previous reports the sand stringers within Zone 2. What we want to do is we want to scour all of the available lithology data that we have from wells within this area and see if we can't correlate our TDS or our brackish water, where we have brackish water, and see if we can't find some of these sand stringers that we might be able to put a well into and pump from. And we also want to see if we can identify where we have brackish water we can take out from HGZ3. Next slide. So, just some observations that we have, preliminary observations, where HGZ2 is thinner, the TDS concentrations tend to be lower. Where it's thicker, the concentrations tend to be higher. And this is going to, as we get more and more well lithology data entered into our model, this will be continually updated. The next steps, we're going to collect more TDS data in August, I believe. And as I mentioned before, we're adding additional lithological data into the model. And we want to use this, again, to locate the sand zones within HGZ2 that are potential production. We want to look at the vertical and horizontal extent of brackish water. We want to evaluate this using the AEM data and the additional TDS data. And then once we have that done, we have some areas identified, we want to do a flow and transport model in order to evaluate potential pumping scenarios. So that's kind of the next steps in the future.
I would just point out that we want to do flow and transport modeling. We need to do modeling, and so, yes.
So to kind of wrap this up, I think it's been stated on a number of occasions. Of course, this is not complete by any means. There's still work in progress, but I think it's been demonstrated that this is a pretty comprehensive compilation of a lot of the data that's been collected in the past, as well as new data that's been collected. So just point out that the SkyTem work, based on that, we have identified 3 zones. Again, as I stated before, this model is going to be freely shared with everybody, the Groundwater Authority, the Water Resource Manager, the Navy, DRI. It's meant to be complementary to the work that's been done already. And again, not to be a competitive model. We want to be able to use this to make the existing model perhaps even better. So that's the intent. Next slide. I think we already mentioned this, but again, finalized this model in August, and again, made freely available, and we will continue with the feasibility evaluations in the fall. We're continuing, as Paul indicated, with next steps, be collecting some additional TDS data in the next few weeks, and it'll be an ongoing development of the model. So I think, is there one more slide? Just questions, I think. Yes, questions and comments. So this is a wrap-up. Those of you that have stayed all this time, I really appreciate it, especially those on the phone too. But any comments and questions from those at home, as Paul calls them? Greg or Heather, before we take comments here?
I'm good, but thank you guys very much. This was very helpful for all the detail.
Well, we really appreciate you being on the phone and participating. Thank you, Greg.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any questions either, but...
Okay, thank you as well, Heather. So we have an audience question.
Hello, my name is Adam Bingham, Searles Valley Minerals. This is kind of just a TDS question. I'm curious, are they fairly recent TDS data from the monitor wells that have been drilled and used to these zones? And kind of the reason I ask that question is that KCWA does have lots of monitor wells out there. They currently mostly do elevation, but if needed, we might be able to ask them if they could also take chemical samples that can be used for TDS.
We might ask that they at least do conductivity readings during their next CASGEM event.
Sweet.
Michelle has provided the full database of TDS data that KCWA does have.
Mike.
So that's been
Microphone.
Sorry, I was using my drill instructor voice.
It was fairly loud, which is good.
Michelle has provided the full KCWA database with the TDS, so that has been shared with Paul and the Ramboll team. We'd certainly like to request of Michelle maybe to do some EC measurements and possibly some lab samples of TDS as well, but that's a great idea, so thank you, Adam.
Well, you're welcome. That was an awesome answer. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, anybody else in the audience before we wrap up? It's been almost 3 hours. I appreciate you sitting through it. Hopefully you found value in it. If there are no further questions or comments, thank you again for attending, and we'll bring it to a close.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.